A while back, we did a podcast episode titled Capita Socia Fascia Lib de Marxism. Now, for some reason, that phrase did not catch on. Oh well. It was the expression of the confusion surrounding the casual way that insults are hurled in the political sphere. You're a Marxist and a fascist. That's socialism. You capitalist pig. I'm a libertarian, anarcho-syndicalist, communist, minarchist, whatever. It's the original form of identity politics, meant to convey a sweeping ideology to explain our worldviews or criticize others for theirs. So we're going to continue building on this for the foreseeable future because I recently found myself in a precarious position. When asked to define socialism, I realized I didn't have all that great of an answer. I've studied it, read a bunch, engaged in conversations and thought experiments, but when pressed to really nail it down, I kind of struggled. And for good reason. Socialism is a concept, a theory. It's not in and of itself a practice. It's a framework that's constantly influenced by environmental circumstances. So here I am with a podcast and now a video channel. I'm offering viewpoints and perspectives about socioeconomics, politics, and yet I'm incapable of delivering a precise definition to provide clarity on arguably some of the most important aspects of the disciplines. So that's what this is about. This is the beginning of a new YouTube playlist called ISMs that we'll add to over time, starting with a condensed version of the original podcast episode. UNFTR! The goal for today is not to provide a university-level analysis of the most important social and economic systems in modern history. That would be silly. What I hope to accomplish more than anything is to revel together in the language and nuance of political science. Now, so first we have to basically submit that there are no absolutes, and we should be wary of anyone who attempts to speak in absolute terms about the social sciences. This is art and science mixed together and influenced by politics and culture and technology and religion. Add climate to the equation and things get even more complicated. Obviously, there's more than one rabbit hole that you can jump down, sub-isms, if you will, like anarcho-capitalism, collectivism, humanism, despotism, and such. But we're going to stay focused on a couple of big ones. So today we're going to hit fascism, Marxism, socialism, and communism, which sometimes have crossover, but they're not the same. Oftentimes, when we come in contact with the isms that we're exploring today, they're used in broad strokes to describe multiple things. For example, when we talk about America as a capitalist nation, we've been taught to believe that anything that restricts capitalism, which we sometimes conflate with freedom, is communist in nature. That if we give anything to anyone, we're practicing socialism. And if a leader has a strong opinion or a heavy hand, they're a fascist. We cherish the freedoms that come with democracy, but are democratic nations the only ones with freedom? How do you even define freedom? Can you have a free market system without democracy? Was Karl Marx a communist or a socialist? What's the difference between communism and socialism, for that matter? Is it okay for a libertarian to accept Social Security and Medicare? Does the natural order produce one system or another, or do these systems produce a natural order? To really complicate matters, isms themselves are different in nature, but can sometimes cross multiple states: economic, social, political. Americans have a tendency to describe capitalism, for example, as all three. But it's not a political structure. On the whole, it's an economic framework that supports political and social structures. So let's pull back for a second and frame our discussion today in current American terms. America is a constitutional republic with democratic elections and social welfare protections for many of its citizens. It has an economy modeled on capitalism, infused with socialist programs and policies frequently guided by corporate interests. Now, as I've mentioned on the show before, this unique blend was coined inverted totalitarianism by political theorist Sheldon Wolin. In his words, quote, "One cannot point to any national institution that can be accurately described as democratic. Surely not in the highly managed, money-saturated elections, the lobby-infested Congress, the imperial presidency, the class-biased judicial and penal system, or, least of all, the media," end quote. Illustrating the American political system in this way helps highlight, to me at least, how dicey it can be to ascribe a particular theory to any nation, to any government or philosophy. You don't hear MSNBC or Fox News pundits debating the merits of inverted totalitarianism, but when you hear how Wolin describes it, kind of seems like they should. So back to fascism is our first major ism to unpack. Because this word was so loosely thrown around during the Trump years, it's a good starting point, although we won't spend much time on it. Fascism is a purely political construct that has enormous influence over both economic and social structures, but it is strictly political nonetheless. I can just as easily argue that Donald Trump had fascist tendencies as I can that Barack Obama did as well. But neither would be considered a true fascist, as they did not rule a fascist regime. Donald Trump tried to legislate almost exclusively through executive order and attempted to overthrow the government in his waning days, and those are fascist tendencies. Likewise, Barack Obama too legislated frequently through executive order when deliberately stymied by the legislative process and, oh by the way, murdered tens of thousands of people abroad through drone strikes that were self-authorized without congressional approval. Fun, right? The etymology of fascism has its roots in Roman times from the word fasces, not to be confused with feces, the stuff that drips from Trump's pie hole. Fasces is defined as a bundle of rods with a projecting axe blade, a symbol of power carried by a lictor in ancient Rome. Lictor? I hardly even knew her. As a political party and system, it was popularized by Benito Mussolini in 1919 at the end of World War I. The essential doctrine of fascism is to consolidate all power under the authoritarian rule of a single leader from whom all policies would be disseminated. The term is often expanded to include racial power as well, as demonstrated by Adolf Hitler, but it doesn't necessarily have to. However, it is more often a characteristic than not because the idea of consolidation requires complete assimilation of ideas to which race and culture can certainly contribute. And though I find some of his later work a little problematic and his theories increasingly erratic towards the end of his life, much of Christopher Hitchens' work continues to be unmatched in erudition in the modern era. He described fascism as an irrational cult of violence and death and mass mobilization around the cult of a leader. And that's pretty tight. The complete centralization of power, restricting all forms of speech and movement, economic production and mobility, and extreme militarization are all hallmarks of this ism. It's why I can comfortably say that Donald Trump, for example, had fascist tendencies, but lacked the acumen, wherewithal, and economic circumstances that typically give rise to a fascist leader. Ultimately, the constraints of our republic kept him from seizing total power, but there could be little doubt that given the opportunity, this is how he would have preferred to rule. Karl Marx is often portrayed as a revolutionary, a characterization I'm not all that comfortable with, actually. His ideas were revolutionary and have endured as such, but I think the better framing of the man is as a philosopher, an economist, a sociologist, in much the same way that Adam Smith is remembered. The time Marx was most productive is really important to his legacy, because he was able to firsthand witness the political results of the revolutionary periods in Europe and the New World, the birth of the industrial era and international commerce, and the fragile systems that held them all together. And when Marx was writing with his dear old friend and collaborator Engels, every nation in Europe, with the exception of Britain, was experiencing some degree of revolutionary upheaval. Imagine America in 1968, but everywhere in the world. It was an explosive time, to say the least. One thing that is constantly overlooked, and contrary to the lazy beliefs of today's pundit class, is that Marx saw the good that capitalism delivered. As notable economist Joseph Schumpeter put it, quote, Marx was personally much too civilized to fall in with those vulgar professors of socialism who do not recognize a temple when they see it. In this respect, no better testimony to his broad-mindedness can be offered than the Communist Manifesto, which is an account nothing short of glowing of the achievements of capitalism. And even in pronouncing pro futuro death sentence on it, he never failed to recognize its historical necessity, end quote. Marx wasn't critical of capitalism as an economic system in terms of its ability to generate surplus production, or what he called residue. He was more critical of, quote, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products. The need to constantly expand and pillage new parts of the world in the name of profit was not as offensive to Marx as it was dangerous and wasteful. He further recognized that this constant demand for more created periods of overproduction, the overheating of economies we now associate with boom and bust cycles. Quoting from the Communist Manifesto directly, he said, quote, in these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce." End quote. It's hard to overstate how revolutionary and unique this concept was at the time, and how it holds true to this day. Marx was commenting on a system so preposterous that it can undo itself by being too successful. For example, a nation-state could produce so much food that its economy collapses and its people go hungry. Now, when you put it in these terms and apply it even through today's lens, it's hard to argue against how messed up this is. Marx wasn't doubting capitalism's ability to create, to build, to innovate. In fact, he admitted that these were definitely positive outcomes of capitalism. His problem was that these conditions continually placed the proletariat in precarious positions, owning none of the means, possessing none of the property, and little of the capital except in the form of wages. And the only way to push through the inevitable bust cycles was by, quote, "on the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones," end quote. It's a vicious cycle that prevents the lower classes from acquiring physical capital and the means to grow wealth, one that requires subjugation of an entire class of people. So ultimately, Marx wasn't agitating for a revolution as much as he was predicting one where the working class would rise in unison, having been united by the global and commercial trade mechanisms, ironically, developed by the bourgeoisie to expand their exploitative reach. This would culminate in a workers' revolt that swelled beyond nationalism and placed the means of production into the hands of those who produced. Putting this into political theory, Marx stated clearly, quote, "The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few," end quote. He concludes with a simple line that summarizes the manifesto. Quote, "In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property," end quote. This simple but extremely radical idea is anathema to almost everyone living today, but it's important to remember that property in this sense means those fixtures of economic production that produce capital on the back of labor. Machines, factories, equipment, buildings, bridges, roads, railways, the means of production. That's the property that he reasoned would someday return to those who labor rather than those who profit. In proving his logic, he turns capitalist convention on its head. We're conditioned to believe that private property is the foundation of everything. Banks loan people money because they have capital or collateral. You can build wealth by leveraging equipment and resources. But Marx simply turns this around and says, quote, "In your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population." So basically what he's saying is, if 90% of the population already doesn't own the means of production, then it must not be entirely necessary for production to occur. We're not giving anything away to the 90% of people. We're just taking it away from 10. Marx goes on to introduce all of the potential arguments to his thesis that labor should own the means of production and dismantles each one of them. He concludes with the core tenets of the communist agenda that include rational arguments more recognizable today: progressive taxation, the benefits of free education, centralizing communication and transportation, centralizing credit and capital, eliminating inherited wealth, and the abolition of land ownership for private rents, essentially demonetizing housing away from landlords. Marx believed in the natural path of capitalism to socialism to a state of communism, a state that he leaves rather undefined, as he knew that this future state would be influenced by the natural resources, technology, and evolution of human behavior. But to the extent that communism was an evolved form of socialism, academia has been able to kind of theorize what the state would look like within the loose framework he provided. To further this point, Marx believed that ideology itself was a function of class. Therefore, in a state and society in which class no longer exists, neither can ideology. Schumpeter refers to Marxism as more of a religion than an ideology or doctrine, and I think that's pretty accurate in that this is something that posthumously is thrust upon a man who himself was continuing to learn, to adapt, and evolve to the very end of his life. The doctrinal elements of what we typically associate with Marxism today are really just observations of existing systems and conditions, and a philosopher's prognostications of what must ultimately come next, many of which did not come to pass, something we'll examine when we do a deeper dive. This elusive endgame of communism was wholly theoretical, and the world has yet to see it in action. Communism is a social, economic, and political order whereby the people are in complete control of all societal levers. So in this sense, it's somewhat better described as utopian socialism. The state would control all aspects of economic activity, but only as a mechanism to evenly and fairly distribute the outputs: education, food, capital, shelter, and so on. A state that is controlled by the people is not an authoritarian and controlling regime. So communism, in the strictest terms, is fantastical in my opinion. It's a lot like my criticisms of Milton Friedman and his utter devotion to the idea of the free market. Both of these concepts require a complete suspension of disbelief because they fail to incorporate the natural tendencies of greed. Greed for money, greed for power, greed for hoarding and for subjugation. Unfortunately, I believe these to be natural instincts of humankind rather than byproducts of economic systems. And to prove this, I present to you all of human history. What's more realistic and easy to wrap our heads around is socialism. So let's talk about socialism, shall we? Our understanding of socialism today was cultivated in the propaganda campaigns throughout the Cold War. Same for communism. In fact, the two are often inextricably linked despite the vast differences between them. Remember that in the first half of the 20th century, figures like Eugene Debs were serious political candidates for social progress, and leading intellectual figures like John Dewey, Walter Lippmann, Rosa Luxemburg, and John Maynard Keynes were debating the merits of a just society. The New Deal era reforms and the encroaching success of these intellectual discussions were creating a backlash among the moneyed elite who sought to demonize socialism in America. A propaganda campaign that initiated the Cold War, a term coined by Lippmann in fact, would later be weaponized through several conflicts around the globe. And to be fair, on the other end of the spectrum, the Soviets were hard at work trying to define their totalitarian empire as a socialist state, and they called it communism. When the generation of revolutionary figures in Eastern Europe, such as Trotsky and Lenin, who were directly inspired by Marx, attempted to convert his philosophical doctrine into a functioning and revolutionary system, it was thought that this was the vehicle by which true socialism would be delivered in the vision that Marx intended. It may have earnestly begun as such, but Russia was not Germany, and Lenin and Trotsky were not Marx and Engels. At the turn of the 20th century, when the Bolsheviks were agitating, it was mostly from afar. From the relative safety of Germany and France, Marx's self-styled successors would launch propaganda campaigns to stoke the flames of discontent among the working class in all countries. Their vision was to ignite a revolution among the peasantry of Russia to seed a revolution that would ultimately spread throughout all of Europe, and hopefully the world. And it should be noted that Russia really wasn't considered the ideal breeding ground for communism by Marx or Lenin and Trotsky, because it had yet to graduate from feudalism to capitalism. It was Germany that was thought to be a far better experiment because it had adopted a market economy and was tending towards socialist reforms during their time. But the bourgeois resistance was too entrenched in Germany and other parts of Europe, and therefore less susceptible to their revolutionary ideas. Like most revolutionaries who stoked the flames of discontent and overthrow a government, Lenin found it convenient and necessary, I suppose, to put his foot on the neck of the proletariat he so loved in order to force a socialist state with revolutionary speed. You know, for their sake. Lenin's firm hand would lay the groundwork for Stalinism, one of the most horrific and brutal regimes that ever existed. Gradually, the government of Lenin and then Stalin moved further away from anything that resembled the ideas of Marx and Engels, except in the way that they romanticized their rule and sold it to the world. On the surface, there appeared to be certain core tenets of Marx's philosophy in the way that Lenin approached Russia's revolutionary renaissance: state control, equitable distribution of goods, and so on. But none of it was natural. None of it was real. There was no evolution, no plan, just total authoritarian centralization of power and means, leaving the people with little more than meager possessions. The people controlled nothing. The elite The ruling monarchs were simply replaced by a ruthless state apparatus. But because we were so successful in painting Russia as a socialist state, and the Russian communists were equally successful in the same idea but for different reasons, we came to equate the Soviet experience with the deliberate socialist outcome. Which is why conservative media can rinse, wash, and repeat the same stupid and vulgar message about socialism over and over and over again. So if communism is a state in which the people literally control everything, from government to education to resources and capital, then what is socialism, and why did Marx consider it the bridge between capitalism and communism? Socialism honestly has dozens of definitions and scores more interpretations, perhaps more. The basic concept is the elimination of private property. Again, not your house, the means of production, and centralization of economic interests. Socialism, at its core, and as Marx interpreted it, was an economic critique of capitalism, pure and simple. Government was even secondary, a supporting player. So let's use the United States as our case study. Most people struggle to identify socialism in the U.S. beyond the post office. It's usually the #1 response that Americans have when asked to spot socialism domestically. But we do have programs that can and should be recognized as socialist in nature. Senior citizens have Medicare and Social Security payments. They might live in subsidized housing. Many of us have access to public sewage treatment, public water systems, bridges, tunnels, roads, highways, public school, and yes, the post office. You know, the stuff that works for everyone. But the conservative class believes that the real good stuff, like landing a man on the moon, automobiles, iPhones, and the internet, are all products of capitalism. Of course, this is intellectually bankrupt as well. Telephony was funded by the government, and the spectrum that it rides on is managed by the government as well. The internet, created by the government. The government landed a man on the moon because it wanted to. Even the great Tesla was seeded with government money, and the cars themselves drive on government roads. And the emission standards, the incentives that make Tesla so successful, were crafted by the government. The government, in all of these cases, is the central authority that socialism kind of speaks of. The capitalist twist is that we've allowed for private ownership and external shareholders to reap the excess rewards rather than allowing them to filter through those most responsible for producing them. But promoters of capitalism, or at least what they believe to be capitalism, think that innovation can only be fostered by the quest for money and profits. That's just never been the case. Money and profits might amplify capital flow into these innovations, but they rarely reflect the genesis of an idea. And the fact that Marx himself stated that a progressive tax was an essential element of socialism means that private accumulation of capital isn't excluded from the equation. It implies that it's very much a part of the economic engine. You're just not allowed to keep all of the excess capital that is periodically generated due to market conditions. Market conditions that, once again, rely on a centralized authority to guide the direction and production and distribution of goods and services to each according to their needs. Excess capital is a condition of all economic activity, just as there are periods of deficit. It's how these periods impact the individual as a part of a society that matters. Nearly everything we understand about economic structures and producing goods and services can remain intact so long as the surplus production, the residue, the excess, is distributed evenly among a citizenry rather than hoarded among the non-producers at the top. If eliminating billionaires means that everyone is educated and fed, and our sick and our elderly are cared for, and our communities are safe, then there's all you really need to know about the meaning of socialism. Here endeth the lesson.